Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host, Jenn, today. It's so nice to see you. Well, I'm not seeing you, but it's nice to, be here. We have two very exciting researchers and translators with us today. I am so excited to talk about this source that they have brought to us in its first English language translation. Could I ask you to introduce yourselves and your book, please?
Sure. Let me begin. My name is Mairaj Syed. I'm an associate professor of religious studies and Middle East South Asian studies at the University of California, Davis. And I specialize in actually the history of Islamic thought. The book is essentially a translation of this super important treatise on the plague written by this 15th century monumental figure for Sunni Muslims, this guy named Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. And that is kind of the very brief description of the book, and we're excited to get into it in the interview.
And I'm Joel Blecher. I'm an associate professor of history at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., currently also a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Like Mairaj, I'm also a scholar of Islamic thought and Islamic history, and also very interested in this figure, the author today, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who was a very famous judge, scholar of hadith, historian. He was also a spice trader, or had come from a family of spice traders, and someone who features in my first book on hadith, and is featuring in my current book on the spice trade. So was very happy to spend the pandemic working on this translation with Mairaj. This collaboration brought our mutual interests together to bring his book on the plague to a wider audience of readers.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. This is such an interesting source, and it's such a lovely translation. And before we get into it specifically, I wanted to ask you sort of about translation, as it were, because all pre-modern researchers have to do translation in order to do their research and write their books. But I'm wondering, how does tackling a full-length edition of a source, how does that differ from what you do in the course of your research, and how did you approach this text?
That's a great question. So I think you're right. Like working with pre-modern societies, most people are going to have to rely on doing some amount of translation. For both Joel and I, pre-modern Arabic sources was our bread and butter of our research for our previous scholarship. And this was the first time that we sat down, and instead of translating, snippets here and there, we translated an entire work from front to back. And it was, I would say, a very enriching experience for myself. Because, whereas previously you kind of have a very selective and utilitarian view of your source, you translate only the material that you think is going to make it into the article or the book. Obviously you read wider than, a selection or a passage for your own understanding. But this work kind of forced us to grapple with Ibn Hajar as this, great personality who had a cohesive argument running through the entire work from beginning to end. So it was really nice to just sit with the text, to try to follow Ibn Hajar's reasoning as he shifted from one chapter to the next. And, being forced to translate the entire work, I think gave at least me, Joel can speak about his own experience, a much greater appreciation for how these pre-modern Islamic medieval thinkers conceived of their work as a holistic argument and as relevant to the variety of different intellectual projects that they were involved in their lifetime.
Yeah, I just to jump on that, I mean, this is the work of a polymath, someone who had expertise not just in hadith, but also in law and theology. He even read medicine and thought deeply about it. He was also a poet and was actually a pretty good poet. Not every judge was a great poet, but there are scholars of Arabic literature who read Ibn Hajar's poetry and analyze it and produce translations of it and editions of it. So he, I think, Mairaj and I have said this in our own conversations with each other. This is probably the best kind of graduate, I think we both wish we had done this in graduate school. I mean, translating an entire text from beginning to end, and a text like this one, not a text that's just on one I mean, this is on a single topic, the plague, but because he has to go draw on all of these different literatures to understand the origins of the plague, what are the theological causes of that help us understand the plague and help us resolve these dilemmas, like why is it that innocent people die of plague, innocent Muslims would die of plague, and how can we hold that idea in our head at the same time that we would think that plague could be a punishment for others. There's all of these just a range of complex questions that come up with the law as well. If you're if you're in a city that's beset by plague, are you basically a dead man walking, in the sense, and what does that mean for your inheritance? Are you allowed to, how's that going to change how you manage your inheritance, knowing that you're very likely to die in the near future, even though you're perfectly healthy? It's a wonderfully rich text that really forced Mairaj and I to develop new skills, reading these kinds of texts and translating them. And so for us, the act of translation itself was enormously rewarding process.
Wow. Yeah. As I was reading this, you touched on something that occurred to me. Oftentimes when we're talking about scholarship, when we say something is interdisciplinary, we mean it's like very modern or cutting edge. That's how we sell very new research. But this is a very interdisciplinary text. As you said, he covers law and medicine and poetry and theology and history and oral history and like all these really interesting things.
There's some ghost stories in there too.
Oh yeah, the ghost stories. Oh, I want to talk about that and the Jenn. Like, there's so much great stuff. Yeah, and so I'm wondering, to get back to translation a little bit, like, how did you collaborate on this? Like, how did it work? Like, what was your approach to? Did you split the text up, or did you both look at sections at the same time, or like, what was your practice?
I think in the beginning, when we were pitching the project to Penguin, we both translated some of the same passages simultaneously to get a sense of like, all right, what is this material that we're dealing with? What are our different styles? And then, once, Penguin accepted the project, what we did was we kind of divided up the work according to what we thought our strengths were. So for instance, I cannot translate or really appreciate poetry for the life of me. So, Joel, who has a deep and abiding love of literature, took those sections. Whereas, I have some background in theology and law, so I took those sections. And we kind of divided up the chapters and the sections that way. But we also we read the entire thing. I read all of Joel's drafts of his translations. He read all of my drafts of my translations. We had, the original Arabic in front of us. We were constantly correcting each other. So I would say that, we have Joel has definitely left an imprint on my sections. I've left an imprint on his sections. So it is kind of like a very much a synthetic work of both of our labors, I guess.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Mairaj, but yeah, we would basically take the lead on drafting, a one chapter, and I would do a different chapter. Mairaj would take the lead on drafting chapter. Then we'd send it to each other, and we completely rewrite each other's drafts, send it back, and then we would rewrite those drafts again, send it back, and so on until we finally had something that we were happy with. We originally just drafted kind of a literal, what we kind of came up idea of kind of a literal reading first, to make sure we understand the plain meaning and sense of the text. And then once were satisfied we understood it, and there were times where we had to go back and actually consult the original manuscript that we had access to in digital form. There was a manuscript at the library in Escorial in Spain that was accessible to us during the pandemic. We could, we were happy with it. Then we said, okay, now let's think about voice. Let's think about style. Let's revise what we have right now to make it speak to a contemporary audience, one that best translates what we think the register, that captures the spirit of the original text and its meaning. And that was another process where we would draft to style and send it back, rewrite it, send it back. So it's amazing. It really is a product of the pandemic, because Mairaj and I were completely remote.
We've never met. We haven't met. We have not met one time in person at all.
Yeah, it was it truly was, lockdown scholarship.
I will say this. This is probably my most favorite scholarly project I've ever done yet. And that was because Joel and I had a great working relationship. It was just absolutely, just a joy working with Joel. And I will also say that if I was to do this by myself, it would have taken another 3 years. It's just, at least 3 years if it would have even gotten finished. So, this collaborative project where you have another person that is egging you on, and then, I would get demotivated, Joel would have the energy, and Joel would get demotivated, and I would have the energy. And, we really kind of encouraged each other to kind of keep going and finish the project, we think. And kind of like, we were actually surprised that we were able to pull it off in like 3 years. But I think that the collaboration was definitely a key ingredient in the recipe for successfully doing that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's really impressive. And I think it is funny that you had to write a book remotely about the pandemic in the middle of one. It is like a really sort of like the method acting equivalent of translation.
Definitely.
It was a cool experience.
Yeah.
It was like, as the pandemic was going on and we were reading these passages of like death counts and disagreement and debate and like all kinds of variety of theories as to the origin of the plague. Like, we're reading that in this pre-modern medieval Arabic work, Islamic work, and we're turning on the news and we're seeing it in our contemporary society. Yeah. It was, to me, it was like a very great evidence of like human beings and human communities are human beings and human communities. And that, sometimes we make a too big of a deal between the pre-modern and the modern.
Yeah, the social distancing was a huge debate in the 15th century, and as we were translating the sections about mixing and contagion and, the nature of the transmission of the disease and uncertainty about it, we were living through that. This text really spoke across time to us in that way. And it did offer a sort of brutal comfort. And of course, it also struck us that so little of what's available in English actually captures, you know, actually captures those kinds of debates. I think I always think about Camus' famous book on the plague, which everyone was reading at the beginning of the pandemic. That's actually set in North Africa, in an Arab, in a port city off the coast of North Africa, and there's not a single Muslim character or Arab character in the entire book. So I think, we think about how we weren't prepared, societally for a pandemic, but I think we weren't prepared intellectually and culturally. We had kind of impoverished ourselves in the humanities and in what kinds of histories and texts and cultural imaginations we could draw on to try to make sense of our current situation. So we hope this text, Merits of the Plague, makes a little bit of a dent in that.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things I'd love to talk about is the sort of the gap that this translation fills. Because, especially the last 2-3 years, there's been a lot of discussion of historic plagues and medieval plagues in particular, because we love to go back to those. But, the view that the especially the Western world has is very Western dominated. We think about the plague in Europe and what gets depicted in film and in Monty Python and all these different places. And so it's really valuable to have this perspective of the phenomenon in a totally different place. Could you talk a little bit about what makes what perspective we get from reading Ibn Hajar? Like, what does he add to our Western dominated image of how societies function in plagues, if that makes sense?
Yeah, Joel, why don't you take this one first, and I'll piggyback off of you.
Well, I think there's continuities and departures, right? I talked a little bit about some of the continuities, the fact that, it's almost like when a pandemic happens, we should expect that there would be division and debate over basic issues of the origin, the transmission, and what some of the public health, the best practices in response. And of course, in Ibn Hajar's day, that was inflected by religion, religious commitments, religious understandings. But he also thought he didn't see religion and science as being in competition with each other. He also cared deeply about what he could observe empirically. And he didn't necessarily think that he read physicians. He actually thought that some of what they suggested had fallen out of practice, that actually could have been useful if it had been put into practice. So I think he offers us a glimpse into another world, which, in a sense, even though he came to different kinds of conclusions, right? He thought about the role of the jinn, these kind of invisible spirits in transmitting the plague, and what that meant legally and theologically. So this sounds like a kind of a different universe, I think, than maybe many of the or some listeners of the podcast, especially in the modern world, will think about. On the other hand, as I said, he's dealing with many of the same mundane issues. Like I said, what do you do? He talks about the economic fallout of plague. He talks about what it's like to travel during the plague, or restrictions on travel, whether people should be restricted or not. Very what we think about as pretty mundane issues. But the other thing I'll say is that it's maybe has become this idea that Europe during this period is a bit on the periphery of what is happening in the world. So in a certain sense, to understand the plague as a pandemic, and not just as something that happened as part of Europe, looking into Islamic literature, I think, a Muslim scholar like Ibn Hajar, who's positioned at the fulcrum of the spice trade in Cairo, who is connected, to this wider world, is really actually well positioned to really give you a sense of some of the broader, to think about the plague as a broader worldwide phenomenon. And in that sense, I think this book gives you some insight, at least into the sense of the plague's, the wider sense of this plague spread.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that really inspired us to even take this project on was to, bring in some non-European voices into the mix of, okay, when we talk about the plague, when we talk about pandemics in pre-modern history, what are we talking about? Well, what does it look like to consider, sources from the Islamic Near East in conjunction with sources from South Asia, East Asia, from the entire world, really. And one of the things that is interesting about this particular source, Ibn Hajar, that may kind of inflects it and gives it a little bit of a different feel from sources from other areas, was the fact that much of the material that makes up the treatise are quotations or stories about the Prophet Muhammad. So what is interesting is in either during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, definitely shortly thereafter, that community, that society was dealing with an outbreak of the plague, and the variety of responses, religious and non-religious responses that generated end up getting recorded in very authoritative sources, specifically hadith, or these stories about the Prophet Muhammad. And then what happens is, a few hundred years later, Ibn Hajar, sitting in Cairo in the 15th century, and shortly after, the outbreak of the plague, about 100 years before, he is both and himself experiencing minor outbreaks of the plague. They end up, taking the life of his children. He himself gets struck by the plague as well, but he recovers. So he has that personal experience. And then he's looking through his inherited historical tradition of these statements attributed to the Prophet, which recorded their experience. And so it is really, he is interpreting his own experience through the prism of early Islamic sources. And that's I think that's what you end up getting, is a very, very interesting, vivid, and different view of disease, of vulnerability, of death and dying and martyrdom and compassion and all of these things than what you might find in Christian Europe, for instance.
Yeah, I think that's also kind of captured by the title of the book as well, Jenn. The idea of merits of the plague. It sounds so counterintuitive, right? When you think about the plague, I mean, you have that Monty Python image in your head, right? I mean, there's not a thing that seems like there's much merit to it. Of course, it's part of Ibn Hajar's argument that this is actually an important time, morally, spiritually, for a person to have the opportunity to live through a plague time, carries a special responsibility. And the question of social mixing and contagion is bound up with those social responsibilities to care for others, not to flee a place that's beset by plague, not to leave people dead, without and unburied, without being washed and prepared. I mean, you start to understand the way in which certain kind of public health measures or ideas are intertwined with these religious and moral sensibilities of the time. And I think, the idea of the book, in a certain sense, is, the argument of the book, that there are ways, to attain certain kinds of merit, ordinary people, ordinary acts of kindness, is this is, in a certain sense, a practical guidebook for the people of Ibn Hajar's time to really try to understand what it is they're living through. And so in that sense, this idea of practicing patience, care for others is I think a radical response to the uncertainty that a pandemic stirs up, the chaos, the uncertainty. And so it's you really have to read the entire book to kind of hear out how he grounds his argument, how he structures it, because it is counterintuitive when you first hear about it.
Yeah, the first thing I thought when I was finished reading it is that it is remarkable how this text feels, it tries to take this wide view of the causes of the plague and how it's being dealt with in the present. And but also it does feel intensely personal too, because it is, prompted by his own experience and his own observations. And that balance between being super personal and very almost global in its perspective is really very striking. And I love actually his point, yes, about the merits of the plague, about it is this opportunity for compassion and care and community. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the research that you did in the past maybe informed your perspective while translating, because I know that you, Joel, worked on Hadith commentary, and you said that you encountered his work there. And you, Mairaj, you have worked on coercion and responsibility in theological and juridical sources. And I was particularly wondering if you, did you encounter Jenn there? Do they come up in that issue?
No, actually, I don't think Jenn, no, I can decisively say Jenn played no role in the legal and theological debates about responsibility and coercion. So if I just looked at the reading that I did for that book and the sources that I looked at that book, you would come away with the idea that Jenn play a marginal, negligible role. There are these seen beings that populate the earth alongside human beings that are also morally culpable and responsible before God because they have free will, but they do not in any way, practically speaking, at least interfere and affect human affairs, at least not according to the theology and the law that I read before I got to this book. Where actually they are a force and they have an effect and they are an explanation for the plague. So that's a short answer.
That's very interesting to me that you do get different perspectives and different types of sources.
Yeah, I do wish I could go back and rewrite my first book after having translated this one, because it does change your mind, on how Ibn Hajar's own vision of reality. And of course he actually he borrows, in a certain sense, copies and pastes some of his hadith commentary on the plague into this book and supplies it for readers here. But what's I think it does underline this bigger idea that I argued in my first book on hadith commentary, which is that when commentators or exegetes are dissecting and picking apart hadith, line by line, word for word. It can sound like a very abstract process, of a scholar or a sheikh, working, at home in their room by themselves by candlelight, or maybe just dictating to students and trying to figure out obscure words and obscure terms, but not really connecting what they're studying to their lives, their society, the world around them, the everyday world around them. And the plague is this great example where you have to, nobody can escape it, including the intellectuals and the scholars. And Ibn Hajar, he's a person who does all of this abstract thinking, this polymath, a scholar, but he's also a judge, someone who's thinking about this world. He's someone, as you said, Jenn, or as Mairaj mentioned, who's lost children to the plagues. This isn't something he can ignore. So he really brings to bear what he's learning from these texts, and connecting them with what he's seeing around them. And that was part of the point of my first book, was to show that there was a social history of interpretation, and there was a politics to interpretation, and it's not just abstract reasons and exegetes, thinking abstractly about hadith, but the way in which they bring the world around them to bear on their texts, or the way in which their interpretations are conditioned, were conditioned the way they interpret these texts. So it all links up eventually. It all connects. But yeah, this was, Mairaj said earlier, this was one of the best collaborations, and I echo the sentiment. I learned so much from this. And Mairaj and I were both in graduate school together. Actually, I don't know if we mentioned that. We used to work in a basement of our academic building, a few feet apart from each other. And so we've known each other now for, I think, 15
At
years
least
more, 16, 17 years. So, this, yeah, in a certain sense, maybe we're still in graduate school, Mairaj, and
it
now
definitely
we
had
can go
that
get our
feel.
PhDs.
It definitely had that feel. As we're back in the basement.
Mhm.
That makes total sense to me because, there are many ways in which I'm very glad to be done with grad school, but there are a lot of parts of it I miss, and I do miss that sort of ease of collaboration and the exchange of ideas. And, so yeah, this is so exciting. And I am so happy that you came to talk about this book with us. Thank you so much for visiting our show.
Thanks for having us. We really,
Thanks,
really
Jenn.
appreciate it.
Oh, you're so welcome. Okay, listeners, so please check out Merits of the Plague. It is an absolutely fascinating glimpse into, the social history of pandemics, the medical history of pandemics, all sorts of interesting topics that are horrifically relevant at this moment. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.